We stand for the Gospel reading. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Do not let your hearts be troubled. You have faith in God. Have faith also in me. In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. If there were not, would I have told you that I am going to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back again and take you to myself, so that where I am, you also may be. Where I am going, you know the way. Thomas said to him, Master, we do not know where you are going, so how can we know the way? Jesus said to him, I am the way, and the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you know me, then you also know my Father. From now on, you do know him, and you have seen him. Philip said to him, Master, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. Jesus said to him, Have I been with you so long a time, and you still do not know me, Philip? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Do you not believe that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me? Words inspired by God. People love to mess around with time, because time basically is a human construct. You know, because of this tiny size of our brain, we have to break stuff up into bite-sized pieces and process them sequentially. So we love to mess around with time. And not just, important people like Einstein and his theory of relativity. We're constantly playing around with time, and it creates a whole bunch of anomalies. So even if you have a kind of a passing knowledge of Latin or Spanish, and you look at the calendar year, it raises problems immediately. So how come that September, in Latin and Spanish, sept means 7. So how come September isn't the 7th month of the year? It's the 9th month. Octo, in Spanish and Latin means 8. So how come October is the 10th month of the year instead of the 8th month of the year? Often the nov means 9. So how come November is the 11th month of the year instead of being the 9th month of the year? And how about DEC, as in like decathlon or decimal? DEC means 10. So how come December is the 12th month of the year instead of the 10th month of the year? It's all the Romans' fault. And way back when, the Romans had a calendar of only 10 months. And it went in the following way: January, February, March, April, May, June, September, October, November, December. So September was number 7, October was number 8, November was number 9, and December was number 10. And then at some stage they figured out that this 10-month calendar wasn't really lining up with astronomical reality or with the orbit or how the Earth went around the sun. So they adjusted it, and they stuck in 2 extra months. In between June and September, they stuck in 2 months, and they named one for Julius Caesar, so they called it July. And they named the second one for Augustus Caesar, so they called it August. And so now, September, October, November, December are out of sync. So the astronomy is a little bit better, but the number system is totally out of whack. About 1,500 years later, another Roman called Gregory the Great, the Pope at the time, he brought in the Gregorian calendar in October of 1582. And he tried to tweak it to align better with the Earth's orbit around the Sun, 365.2524 days. And so he introduced the notion of a leap year, which is really complicated because we think the leap year happens every 4th year, but that's not quite accurate. If the year is divisible by 100, there isn't a leap year, unless it's divisible by 400, and then it is a leap year. So all these kind of machinations to try to align the calendar. And to make matters worse, when he introduced it in October of 1582, he skipped from October the 4th to October the 15th. in 1582, there was no October 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, or 14th. You jump straight from 4 to 15. So people are constantly messing around with time. We're still trying to figure out what time is. And one of the things we do is we like to assign particular properties to particular months. And that's basically what I'm going to talk about today. I want to talk about the importance we assign to the 11th month in our calendar, which is actually November. So I'm going to make just 3 main points this morning. I'm going to talk about, firstly, about the afterlife, and then secondly, about indulgences, and then thirdly, about the notion of the communion of saints. So we have dedicated the month of November in a very particular way to people who have passed on. Now, this is actually based on the old Celtic feast of Samhain. So the Celtic year began on what we call Halloween, October 31st. But for the Celts, as for the Hebrews, the day actually began at sunset. So actually Halloween is basically the 1st of November for the Celts. And that was a time of the year when the veil between the dimensions was really, really diaphanous. And there was a lot of communication went on between it. And for the Celts, they had a very different notion of light and darkness. The year began with the darkness. It began with Samhain, or November 1st. And then the light came at the beginning of May, 6 months later. But unlike us in the West, for the Celts, light and darkness were lovers. They weren't enemies. So darkness was the fertile womb that gave birth to all of life. And so it was the darkness that gave birth to the light. So light and darkness are lovers. They're not at odds with each other. So at this time then, you had what we call in Gaelic a ÓLaoire, a thin place. And a thin place is not just about a specific geographical location where spirit is very close, but there are thin times. There are particular times of the year when the veil is diaphanous. And this was one such time. Now, the Christian church then took over this and they grafted some ideas onto it. So for November the 1st, they called it the Feast of All Saints. So people at the other side who were in heaven. And then November the 2nd was the Feast of All Souls. People who had died but weren't saints. And then the Catholic Church in Ireland added November the 6th is the Feast of All the Saints of Ireland. So already, you got 3 dates in early November, the 1st, the 2nd, and the 6th, dedicated to people at the other side. Now, I don't believe in the idea of life after death, that there's an afterlife. I don't believe in an afterlife, for the simple reason that there is only one life and it never ends. So I do believe, obviously, in the survival of consciousness. But to talk about a life and an afterlife is to suggest that life ends and some other state begins. And I don't believe that for a moment. I think there is only one life. It's God's life. It's God's energy or vitality, whatever word you want to give to it. And that this manifests in all her creation, in every single dimension. It's the same life. It's the same vital force that animates everything, including all sentient beings in the physical world, including all humans. But there's one life which all of us share. We share with the flora and we share with the fauna. We share with all manifest reality. There's just one vital life force. There is only one. So there can't be a life and an afterlife as far as I'm concerned. There's only a life. But this life happens in several phases. And for us humans, I believe, we experience it in 4 phases. We experience a pre-incarnational phase, where these bite-sized fractals, these holographic fractals of God, experience themselves in a disincarnate form. And then phase 2, they volunteer for incarnation. So the second stage is an incarnational experience of life. And then we shuffle off this mortal coil, and then there's a third phase. It's the post-incarnational phase of the same life force. Buddhism will call this the bardo state. And then the fourth one is re-incarnational phase, where we cycle back through this again. But there's only one life force moving through all of that from God, through all creatures in all phases. So I don't believe in the notion of an afterlife. I simply believe in the notion of life going through different kinds of phases. Now, religion, of course, is trying to manipulate this reality in its own ways. So in the Roman Catholic version, we've created like 4 versions of the afterlife. And the 4 versions are these. We created Limbo, we created Purgatory, we created Hell, and we created Heaven. And the belief system was, if you were raised Catholic, and most of us were, that, after life, you were in one of these 4 condos for a period of time. So let's start with Limbo. So we all know the notion. Limbo was the notion of trying to reconcile 2 Catholic teachings. The first one is that you can't get to heaven unless you're a baptized Catholic. Now, if a little baby dies before it can be baptized, it can't get to heaven because it's not a baptized Catholic. At the same time, it's never committed any personal sin, so you can't send it to hell. And so they created this kind of like a daycare center called Limbo, where babies go who are not baptized, but they haven't committed any sin. So presumably, God sends angels down there to change their diapers and feed them a bottle feeding, but they're warned, never mention the name God, or else the kids will start asking awkward questions. Who is God? Where is he? Why can't we see him? So Limbo was that place. Now, I remember in Ireland in my childhood, and still there are places in Ireland which are called Killeens, or in Gaelic, Killini. And Killini means the special graveyards where unbaptized babies were buried. They could not be allowed to be buried and rub shoulders with corpses who were going to heaven or hell. So there were special little graveyards, and they're called Killini. And you can still identify it by place names in Irish, where these little infants were buried, separated from their families, from their parents, in a special little graveyard. Now, very, very quietly, without any fanfare, whatever, a few years ago, and I can't put my finger exactly when, the Catholic Church very quietly shut down Limbo and presumably bussed all the kids up to heaven. But there was no word about it. There was no great pronunciation that I've ever heard of about this. So that was the first condo. The second condo was Purgatory. Now, personally, I believe that Purgatory is the Catholic version of reincarnation. So basically, Purgatory is a place where people, who didn't merit going straight to heaven, and they didn't die with mortal sins on their souls, so they couldn't go to hell, and they weren't baptized, so they couldn't go to Limbo, so there's this place called Purgatory. And they go there for a period of time, could be years and years and years and years, to undergo some kind of a purification until they were ready to go to heaven. Now, by any other title, that's reincarnation. Reincarnation is the notion that we keep living until finally the soul realizes it's a bite-sized piece of God and starts acting and relating only out of love and totally out of love, and then they get to heaven. So Purgatory was that version in the Catholic thing. Then there was the third condo, and that was hell, where for eating sausages on a Friday or skipping Mass on a Sunday, that you could be consigned to everlasting fires by a merciful God, handed into the clutches of a psycho called Satan and his merry band of sadists. How we could actually believe that any loving God, for a sin committed in a tiny little fraction of time, would be punishable by an eternity of flames and pitchforks beats me. But as far as I'm concerned, there is no such thing as hell. Ontologically, it does not exist. You cannot be separated from God any more than a sunbeam can be separated from the sun. Now, we've created hells. We create them psychologically in our own minds, and we create them sociologically by the wars. This great first reading that we heard this morning. 20 million people dying in the Great War that was supposed to end all wars. And of course, it didn't end all wars. And this notion of hell, we've created sociologically for each other or psychologically for ourselves. But ontologically, it does not exist. You cannot be separated from source any more than the wave can be separated from the ocean. There may be a temporary time when the wave is washed up onto a beach. It very, very quickly retreats. It goes back and joins Mother Ocean. And then there's the notion of heaven. But the problem is there's so many different versions of heaven. There's a Buddhist version of it. There's a Hindu version of it. There's an Islamic version of it. There's a Catholic version of it. And they all have their different requirements. You have to do this in order to get to heaven. And you can't do that in order to get to heaven. So the problem is, if you choose one of these and it's wrong, you're screwed. So can you cover all your bases? You can't, because some of the requirements are mutually exclusive. There are some beliefs for instance, in Islam, that if you adopt, you can't be Catholic anymore. There are some beliefs in Hinduism, and you can't be Buddhist anymore. And so you can't cover all your bases. So you got to decide on one of them. And it's like, you can't bet on all the horses. You can only bet on one of the horses. So that's a crazy notion of heaven, that you can only go to heaven by following particular practices or engaging with particular belief systems. When I was teaching in Kenya, I would pun in Swahili when I talked about heaven, and I would say, Mbinguni si mahali bali ni hali. You can hear the alliteration, even in English. And what that means is, heaven is not a place; it's a state of being, and that's what I understand that. When we shuffle off this mortal coil and we enter what's being called the afterlife, which of course is just an extension of life, then we pick up exactly where we left off. That the mindset we had as we died is the mindset which we greet and are greeted in the other side. And we continue to evolve on the other side just as much as we continue to evolve here. So if your mindset is that you get to heaven and you've got 72 virgins, that's your experience at the other side. If your mindset is that you die, and you get a harp and a halo, that's what you experience at the other side. If your mindset is, on death, you reconnect with your family of origin, grandparents or whatever, that's what you get. You can get anything you want. But you're going to evolve through this until finally you get to a place where the ultimate heaven is the realization that there is only God. Everything that exists, even in the heavenly realms, is simply a fractal of source. And ultimately then, there is only God. The game is folded up and you become one with God and you experience everything as God. You're not losing anything, you're gaining everything. Instead of being a wave, you're the ocean. Instead of being conditional love, you're unconditional unity experiences. So that's what I think about the afterlife and the kind of the four condos. It's my first point. My second point then, I want to talk about indulgences. All of us who were raised Catholic are well aware of what this involved. So I remember as a small child, and I'm sure Margie and others, Maureen, all of you who were raised Catholic, Ron, you all got this training that on the 2nd of November every year, All Souls Day, every time you went into a church and you said an Our Father, a Hail Mary, and a Glory be to the Father for the Pope's intentions, you released a soul out of purgatory. You got a plenary indulgence and you sprang one soul out of purgatory. And as a small kid, we'd run into the church, we'd say, Our Father, heart, now, Hail Mary, Glory be to the Father, Son, and then you'd rush outside and then come back in again. You couldn't do it, all at the same time. You had to go out of the church and come back in. You couldn't just stay there for an hour and get 15 people out. You had to go out of the church, leave it, and then come back in again. And as kids, we'd be racing in and out of the church, trying to spring as many souls as purgatory. And I had this crazy notion as a child. It's like there's a gatekeeper in purgatory and there's a gatekeeper in heaven. And every time you win a plenary indulgence, the guy in purgatory says, this is purgatory. We're releasing a soul whose social security number is 123-45-6789. And the guy in heaven says, Roger, over and out. Yes, we're open. We're going to receive the soul whose, social security number is 123-45-6789, over. And they go backwards and forwards like this. It's like, road repairs. You come across road repairs and there's a guy with a stop sign and there's another guy 100 yards on the road and they turn the sign around and it says, go. And then some traffic comes through and then you turn it back and it says, stop. So every time you get a plenary indulgence, the sign says, go, and somebody comes out. So I'm sure most of you, were brought up with that mindset, that you were in and out of the church on November 2nd trying to release souls from purgatory. It's a lovely idea, but it's crazy making. So I remember I got to the seminary on September 14th, 1964, just a few weeks before my 18th birthday. I finished high school and I got to the seminary. And we were given these little prayer books as seminarians with a whole bunch of special prayers and special spiritual practices. And attendant upon every one of these prayers or practices was an indulgence of some kind. Maybe 300 days indulgence, or 3 years indulgence, or 7 years indulgence, or plenary indulgences for various practices. And I began to think, I'm going to create a team purgatory. I'm going to organize a system where we'll clean out purgatory as fast as possible. And so I started. I was always really good at math. So I found out that the world population in 1964 was 3.26 billion people. And the Catholic population was 500 million. So typically, over the last 2 or 3 centuries, the Catholic population of the world has been about 16% of the total population. So there's about 500 million Catholics at this stage. Now, I know also that roughly 200,000 people die every day, which is about 73 million, every year. And so I'm thinking, wow, can we really look after 73 million people every year? And I think, it's not actually that complicated. For one thing, the only people in purgatory are Catholics. If you're not a Catholic, you can't get to heaven. All non-Catholics go to hell. So that means that, you only have to get 1/6 of them out, 16%, And I also realize that there's a whole bunch of Catholics who've gone to hell for eating sausages on a Friday or skipping Mass. So I can't do anything about those. You can't get those out. And there's a whole bunch of unbaptized babies in limbo. So really my job is much easier. So I figured out the math, I created an algorithm, and I figured out that there's the newbies in purgatory account for about 2 million people every year. I figured, 2 million, I can handle that, 2 million. I can set up a Jesus movement. I get the nuns involved, and the priests involved, and the seminarians involved, and I give them this little booklet, and by December 31st every year, we'll have cleaned the show, ready for the next batch of souls going in. Unfortunately, I didn't have either the organizational skills or the personal discipline to see it through. So there's still people in purgatory. So if any of you with your computer knowledge want to set that up and figure out a way of doing it, I'm more than happy to sign up and become a member of that. So that was my experience with indulgences. And thirdly, there's the notion of the communion of saints. And the word saint is a really interesting word because it's been used very differently throughout Christian history. Initially, if you read through the Acts of the Apostles, the word saint is used for any member of the Jesus community. As long as you were a member of the Jesus community, you were called a saint. And that's how you read about it in the Acts of the Apostles. After some time, that kind of usage was dropped, and now saints were just dead people who had proven to be inspirational during their lives. And so we began to think about those and to try to model ourselves on their behavior. So they were the second kind of phase of saints. At some stage, the Roman Church got in and decided, no, we're going to decide who the saints are. So there's a whole process then, a canonical legal process of deciding whether or not somebody, merits being called a saint. And they would set up something like the devil's advocate, whose job was to kind of dig up the dirt on the person who was to be canonized, to make sure that the church didn't wind up with egg on his face afterwards if you canonized somebody and then found out later that he was a reprobate of some kind. So it was a very, very existing system. So that was the third phase of it. And then once a saint was canonized, he or she was given her own particular date in the calendar. But after a while, the calendar is getting filled up. There's no more dates left to insert new saints into. So we got a problem here. So the church decided to demote a whole bunch of old saints who had never actually gone through the legal process. So we lost all the saints of Ireland. Even St. Patrick is not a canonized saint. They were all dumped in order to free up the calendar to make room for real saints who were canonized by the Catholic Church. And then the final piece is, the Mormon Church has their own version. They call themselves the Church of the Latter-day Saints. So they've taken over the title now, saints. So the word saints has a very interesting kind of a history. Now, I think personally that this notion of the communion of saints was one of the best ideas that the Roman Church ever came up with. This idea, it's kind of like a new trinity, that there's, the people in heaven and the people in purgatory and the people on earth form a kind of a trinity of relationships where they can be available to intercede and to help each other out. Now, it's a great idea, but I have two problems with it. The first problem is that it is far too narrow because the communion of saints only refers to Catholics. You can't be a member of the communion of saints if you're not a baptized Catholic. And if you're in hell, you're not a member of the troop. You're only a member of the communion of saints if you're a baptized Catholic still alive, or if you're a baptized Catholic who's in purgatory, or you're a baptized Catholic who made it to heaven. That's the communion of saints, just that triangle. And we can all kind of look out for each other. The people in heaven can help the people in purgatory and the people on earth, and the people on earth can help the people in purgatory and pray to the people in heaven, and the people in purgatory can ask assistance of us and of the saints in heaven. So it's a very interesting idea if it weren't so confined. I much prefer the notion of the bodhisattva in Buddhism, which is a notion that there are some souls who, when they work off all their own personal karma and they don't need to reincarnate anymore, they keep reincarnating anyway in order to help the rest of us to wake up. And they take a vow called the bodhisattva vow that they will keep reincarnating until every sentient creature wakes up to its own inner divinity, its own Buddha nature, or its own Christ consciousness. So for me, that's a much more beautiful notion of the communion of saints. So the second thing I don't like about this communion of saints is the language they employ. So it's really kind of a militant language. And so, for instance, the church, the Catholics who've made it to heaven are called the Church Triumphant. And the guys who are still here on earth were called the Church Militant. And then the people who are in purgatory are called the Church Suffering. So the nomenclature really sucks. But the idea is good if we can only extend it out. So I'd like to end the homily then with a teaching from a great Irish physicist who came up with what some people would regard as the second most important scientific formula of the 20th century. And his name was John Bell. In the 1960s, he came up with this notion of entanglement, the idea that all subatomic particles are connected and in relationship with each other. No matter how far apart they are, if you change any feature of one, you change in the other instantaneously across distances that can't be accounted for even by the speed of light. It's called entanglement theory. And it has since been demonstrated again and again in laboratory conditions that they are all interconnected. Now, I think that that's really what the communion of saints is about. It's entanglement theory at a cosmic, physical and metaphysical level. It's the realization that, entanglement doesn't just involve some kind of an instantaneous transfer of energy or information, between souls, but rather that intention and compassion immediately entangle us with each other. That all of us are neurons on God's brain, and prayer is a mechanism that creates total coherence within the system. So what I think about when I think about November, the month of remembering those at the other side of the veil, is that there is no disconnect whatsoever between us, no matter where we are, in what state, in what dimension, whether we're physical or non-physical, we're totally entangled because we're literally neurons on God's brain. Namaste.